In the autumn of 1999, a surveyor named Edmund Gale was hired to map a stretch of woodland in northern Connecticut, near the border with Massachusetts. His task was routine. The land was being considered for a timber contract, and the company needed accurate coordinates. Edmund worked alone. He preferred it that way. On his third day in the field, somewhere deep in the Ashwick forest, he stopped walking. Not because he was tired, not because the terrain had changed. He stopped because the trees in front of him were wrong. They were too uniform, too perfectly spaced, and the ground beneath them was flat in a way that old forest ground simply is not. He knelt down and pressed his palm against the soil. It was cold. Not the cold of October earth. Something colder. The kind of cold that comes from stone buried just beneath the surface. He began to clear away the dead leaves with his hands, then with a small trowel from his pack. And after about 20 minutes of careful scraping, he uncovered something that made him sit back on his heels and stare. A cobblestone, perfectly rectangular, cut by human hands, and next to it, another, and another. He was standing on a road that appeared on no map, a road that led, as he would discover over the following days, to the remains of a town that the state of Connecticut had no record of ever existing. No census entry, no deed registry, no church record, no newspaper archive, nothing. Just those stones, silent under a century of soil and leaves, waiting for someone to ask the question that no one had thought to ask. What happened to the people of Harrow's Crossing? And why did someone work so hard to make sure the world forgot they ever lived there? Setting the scene. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was there. Harrow's Crossing was, by all accounts that can now be pieced together from fragments, a small but prosperous mill town. It sat at the convergence of two streams in the Ashwick Valley, a natural geography that made it ideal for industry. The main waterway, which locals called the Grey Run, powered two grist mills and a small textile operation. The land around it was good farmland, well-drained and fertile, the kind of soil that rewards patience. The town had been established sometime in the 1860s, likely by a small group of families moving north from the Connecticut River Valley in search of cheaper land. By the 1880s, it had grown to perhaps 300 souls. There was a main street, a church, a school, a tavern that also served as an inn, a blacksmith, a general store, and the rows of modest wooden houses that lined the side roads leading away from the town center. It was, in other words, exactly like 100 other small New England towns of that era. Quiet, hard-working, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the same families had been neighbors for 2 generations, where the rhythms of the year were set by planting and harvest and the grinding cycle of the mills. The nearest town of any size was Caldwell Hollow, about 11 miles to the southeast. The road between the two places was poor, especially in winter, and so Harrow's Crossing had developed a kind of self-sufficiency that was common in isolated communities of that period. They did not need much from the outside world, and the outside world, it seems, did not think much about them, which is perhaps why, when Harrow's Crossing vanished in the autumn of 1899, it took so long for anyone to notice, and why, when people finally did notice, there was already someone there to make sure the question stopped before they could begin. The Ashwick Valley in late October is a particular kind of beautiful. The maples turn first, a deep arterial red that seems almost violent against the gray sky. Then the oaks, slower and more amber. By the end of the month, the hills look like they are burning from the inside, the light coming through the remaining leaves in long copper shafts. The streams run fast with the autumn rains, cold and dark and clear. It was into this landscape that something arrived in the weeks before the end, something that the people of Harrow's Crossing did not understand, something they tried in their way to address, and something that, in the end, they could not survive. The characters. The story of Harrow's Crossing is, at its core, the story of several people whose names we can only partially recover. The most complete record we have is of a man named Silas Ward. Silas was the postmaster of Harrow's Crossing, and it was his position that left the most traces. Postmasters in that era were required to maintain a log of outgoing mail, a record that in some cases found its way into regional postal archives before the town's records were systematically removed. From these fragments, we can reconstruct something of who he was. Silas Ward was 53 years old in 1899. He had lived in Harrow's Crossing his entire life. His father had been one of the founding settlers. He was a tall man, according to a description left by a traveling merchant who had visited the town in 1897, with a careful way of speaking and a habit of pausing before answering any question, as if he were weighing every word before releasing it. He was not a man who spoke easily of fear, which is what makes the letter so significant. In late September of 1899, Silas Ward sent a letter to the county seat in Hartford. The letter is gone now, destroyed along with most of the county records from that period in a fire that investigators later determined was almost certainly deliberate. But a clerk named Thomas Hennessy, who processed the incoming mail at the Hartford office, mentioned the letter in his personal diary. He described it as written in a hasty hand, which was notable because Silas Ward was known for his precise penmanship. He described it as asking about legal procedures for reporting a missing person, and then he wrote one more detail that he seemed to find odd enough to record. The letter asked whether it was possible, under Connecticut law, for an entire household to be considered missing at once. The second figure is a woman named Margaret Coyle. Margaret was the school teacher, 31 years old, unmarried, one of the few residents of Harrow's Crossing who had come from outside the valley. She had arrived in 1895 from Providence, Rhode Island, and by all accounts had been immediately and warmly accepted by the community. She was, in the phrase used by the traveling merchant who described Silas Ward, a woman of considerable intelligence and very little patience for nonsense. Margaret Coyle kept a journal. The journal was found in 1899, not in Harrow's Crossing, but in a train station in Springfield, Massachusetts, stuffed behind a radiator in the waiting room. How it got there is unknown. Whether Margaret Coyle put it there herself, whether someone brought it out of the valley, whether it found its way to Springfield through some chain of hands we cannot trace, we do not know. The journal covers the period from early September to the 14th of October, 1899. The final entry is incomplete. It ends mid-sentence. The third figure is a man known only as the Visitor. He arrived in Harrow's Crossing in early October of 1899. He came from the South Road, on foot, which was unusual. He had no horse, no cart. He carried a single leather bag. He gave his name at the tavern as Mr. Crail, though neither first name nor place of origin was recorded in the way that was customary. He paid in advance, in cash, and he asked, on his first night, to see the town's records. Not land records, not census records. He asked to see the records of the dead. First signs. The trouble in Harrow's Crossing did not begin with the Visitor. The journal of Margaret Coyle makes this clear. She first noticed something wrong in early September, nearly a month before the man called Crail arrived. She writes about it carefully, the way a person writes about something they are not yet willing to name directly. The first entry that concerns us is dated the 4th of September. She writes about her students. Specifically, she writes about the fact that 3 children had not come to school that week, which was unusual for that time of year. September was the beginning of the school term, and attendance was generally high in the early weeks, before the demands of the harvest pulled children away from their lessons. She notes that she had sent a message to the families of the absent children and had received no reply from any of them. She writes, "I am told by Mrs. Harmon at the store that the Aldrich family have not been seen in some days. Their house is shuttered. Their animals are in the barn, and someone has been putting out feed, but no one can say who. The Aldrich family. A father, a mother, 4 children. Their house on the east side of town, near the second mill." By the following week, 2 more families had gone quiet in the same way. Houses shuttered, animals tended by unseen hands. No note, no explanation, no word left with neighbors. In the context of the time, disappearances were not as remarkable as they might seem today. People moved, suddenly and without announcement, for any number of reasons. Debt, illness, a better opportunity somewhere else, a dispute that had grown beyond repair. The lack of formal communication was not unusual. What was unusual, and what Margaret Coyle noticed with the careful attention of an intelligent observer, was the pattern. The families that went silent were not random. They were connected. All of them, she writes on the 12th of September, had been among those who attended the special meeting at the church 2 months earlier. She does not explain what the special meeting was about. She mentions it as if she has already written about it elsewhere, in a portion of the journal we no longer have. But from context, and from a single other reference later in the text, we can piece together something of what it concerned. It had to do with the well. The main well in Harrow's Crossing was located in the center of town, a large stone construction that had served the community since the founding. In the summer of 1899, something had changed about the water. No one could say exactly what. The water looked the same. It smelled the same. But several families had stopped using it, quietly and without publicizing their reasons. And those families, Margaret Coyle began to realize, were the ones who were still there. The ones who had kept drinking from the well were the ones who were disappearing. By late September, Silas Ward had begun keeping a list. He counted 14 households that had gone silent, 73 people by his estimate. Gone. Not violently, not with any visible sign of struggle or distress. Simply gone, the way a candle goes out. Present one day, absent the next. He sent his letter to Hartford. No reply came. And then, in the first week of October, Silas Ward found the marks. They were carved into the stone of the well, not deeply, not in a way that would be immediately visible. You would have to lean over the edge and hold a lantern low to see them. Silas Ward did exactly that on a morning when the mist was still on the valley and the town was quiet. The marks were a series of lines and curves that he did not recognize as any alphabet he knew. They were precise, deliberately made, and they covered the inner rim of the well from the waterline up to the surface. Someone had been at the well at night with a chisel and had left a message that no one in Harrow's Crossing could read. He stood at the well for a long time, in the mist, reading marks he could not understand. 3 days later, the man called Crail walked in from the south road. Escalation 1. Margaret Coyle's first mention of the visitor is dated the 9th of October. She describes him briefly in that entry, the way you describe someone you have noticed but not yet spoken to. A man of middle age, she writes. Gray coat, well made but old. A leather bag that he carries everywhere and that he does not set down, not even when he sits to eat. A quality of attention that she finds unsettling, the way he looks at buildings, at people, at the ground, as if he is measuring things that other people do not know can be measured. She writes, he asked Joseph at the tavern to see the records of the dead. Joseph showed him the church register, which is kept behind the bar for reasons no one has ever fully explained to my satisfaction. The man spent 3 hours with it. He did not take notes. He returned it without comment and went to bed. The following day, he walked to every house on the east side of town, the shuttered ones, the ones belonging to the families that had gone silent. He did not knock. He did not try to enter. He simply stood in front of each house for a period of time, perhaps 5 minutes, and then moved on to the next. By the end of the afternoon, he had visited 11 houses. He returned to the tavern, ate supper without speaking to anyone, and went upstairs. On the 11th of October, he spoke to Silas Ward. We do not have a direct record of this conversation, but Margaret Coyle writes about it secondhand, relaying what Silas told her afterward. Crail had asked Silas about the well, about when the water had changed, about the special meeting, about who had attended and who had not. Silas had answered, she writes, because he was a man who believed in the principle that someone who asks the right questions probably has good reason to ask them. Crail told Silas 3 things in return. The first was that the marks on the well were not a language. They were a sequence, a process, something that had been started deliberately and that was progressing through stages. The second was that the disappearances were not, in the conventional sense, disappearances. He would not explain further what he meant by this. The third was that there was something below the town, below the well specifically, something that had been there for a very long time, far longer than the town itself, far longer than any settlement in that valley. Something that the well, whether by accident or by design, had made contact with. Silas Ward, by Margaret Coyle's account, listened to all of this in his characteristic silence. And then he asked Crail one question. Could it be stopped? Crail's answer, as Margaret Coyle recorded it, was this. I have seen this twice before, in Vermont, in 1861, in the mountains of western Pennsylvania, in 1878. In both cases, by the time I arrived, it was too late to stop it. I am here to understand it, I am not here to stop it. The 14th of October was a Sunday. Margaret Coyle's last journal entry is dated that morning. She writes that she woke before dawn to a sound she cannot describe precisely. She writes that the town outside her window was very quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. She writes that she dressed and went downstairs and found the door of her house already open, though she had locked it the night before. She stepped outside. The street was empty. She walked to the center of town, to the well. Crail was already there, standing at the edge, looking down. She writes, "He did not look up when I approached. I stood beside him and looked down into the well. The water was gone. The marks were still there. But the bottom of the well where the water had been was open. I mean to say that there was no bottom. There was only darkness going down. I could feel air rising from it, warm air, which is not possible." The entry ends there, mid-sentence. The next page of the journal is blank. Escalation 2. The first person outside Harrow's crossing to notice that something was wrong was a farmer named Caleb Root, who lived on the road between Harrow's Crossing and Caldwell Hollow. Caleb Root was not a man of imagination or anxiety. His diary, which survives in the collection of the Connecticut Historical Society under a cataloging error that has kept it obscure for over a century, records the events of that October with the flat precision of a man who has been taught to write facts and nothing else. On the 16th of October, he notes that he had expected a delivery of milled grain from Harrow's Crossing that had not arrived. This was inconvenient but not alarming. Deliveries were sometimes delayed. On the 19th, he drove his cart to Harrow's Crossing to inquire about the delivery. He writes with a brevity that somehow makes the entry more disturbing than any elaboration could. Found the town empty. Every building standing. No damage. No sign of fire or flood or violence. Animals in the barns. Fires laid but not lit in the houses. Tables set. Food prepared and left to spoil. No person of any age anywhere. I called out and received no answer. I returned home. I did not go back. He reported this to the selectmen of Caldwell Hollow. The selectmen sent 2 men to investigate. Those 2 men came back and reported the same thing. A town intact, a town empty. No explanation. A brief inquiry was opened by the county. 2 officials traveled to the valley, wrote a report, and submitted it to the county seat in Hartford. That report is gone. The fire that destroyed it, along with dozens of other county records, occurred in February of 1900, just 4 months later. The fire was ruled accidental. The investigating officer, a man named Gerald Fitch, died of a sudden illness 3 weeks after submitting his preliminary findings. The selectmen of Caldwell Hollow held 1 meeting about the matter. The minutes of that meeting, recovered from a private collection in 2003, record only this: motion to record the settlement of Harrow's Crossing as abandoned due to unknown causes. Motion carried. Further inquiry not recommended. Not recommended. Not concluded. Not resolved. Not recommended. The road to Harrow's Crossing was not officially closed. It was simply not maintained. Within 5 years, the forest had reclaimed enough of it to make it impassable by cart. Within 10 years, the road had ceased to exist as a usable feature of the landscape. Within 20 years, there was no one alive in Caldwell Hollow who could have told you with certainty where Harrow's Crossing had been. But the cobblestones remained, under the leaves, under the soil, under a century of silence, waiting. The dark heart. What was below the well of Harrow's Crossing? This is the question that draws researchers, as it drew Edmund Gale in 1999, and as it drew a small number of others before him who left fewer traces. The most significant prior investigation was conducted by a woman named Dr. Elaine Marsh, a folklorist from Yale University, who visited the site in 1967 after following a trail of references in regional historical literature that she described in a paper she never published as a thread of deliberate omission. Each source she found mentioned Harrow's Crossing only to say that records were unavailable. Each archivist she spoke to remembered a collection that had been removed or reclassified. The pattern was not one of neglect. It was one of active erasure. She found the site after 3 days of searching. She mapped the foundations. She found the well. The well shaft had been partially filled with rubble at some point, she estimated sometime in the early 1900s, not long after the town was abandoned. But the fill was shallow. The shaft went deeper than the rubble. and when she lowered a light on a rope, she found what Margaret Coyle had found on that Sunday morning in October. The shaft had no bottom that she could reach with the equipment she had brought. She wrote, "The air rising from below is warm, which is geologically anomalous for this formation. The shaft walls below the fill line are not stone. They are something that resembles stone, but is not. The surface is too smooth, too regular, and the marks that cover the original stone rim of the well continue below the fill line, continuing downward in an unbroken sequence that I was unable to follow to its conclusion." She sent samples of the material from the shaft walls to a geologist colleague at the university. The colleague's report, which Dr. Marsh quotes in her unpublished paper, states that the material is consistent with a compressed organic compound of unknown origin, formed under conditions of extreme pressure over a period estimated at no less than 8,000 years. 8,000 years. The first European settlers arrived in Connecticut in the 1630s. The indigenous peoples of the region have inhabited the area for thousands of years before that. And below the well of Harrow's Crossing, something had been there for 8,000 years, waiting in the dark, accumulating pressure, building toward something. What the marks mean is still not understood. The most extensive analysis was conducted by a linguist named Professor Haruto Tanaka at the University of Massachusetts, who photographed the interior of the well shaft in 2001 and spent 4 years attempting to decode the sequence. His conclusion, published in a small academic journal in 2005 and largely ignored by the broader academic community, was that the marks were not a language in any conventional sense. They were, in his interpretation, a set of instructions, a sequence of steps, not written for human readers, written as a process that the physical world itself would enact, given the right conditions. A set of instructions that, when completed, would open something, a door, of a kind. The water was the mechanism. The well had drawn the water from a source below, a source that was in contact with whatever lay at the bottom of that shaft. The marks were carved to interact with the water as it rose and fell with the seasons, the sequence advancing incrementally, year by year, decade by decade, 8,000 years of patient progress toward a conclusion. And in the summer of 1899, the sequence had reached its final stage. The families who drank from the well in those last months did not die. There is no evidence of death. There are no bodies, no graves, no bones. They were not killed. They were changed. Changed in what way and into what is the question that has no answer, because no one who was changed was there afterward to describe the experience. No one who witnessed it from the outside was willing to speak about what they saw. And the one man who had seen it before, in Vermont and in Pennsylvania, the man called Crail, left Harrow's Crossing sometime on the night of the 14th of October and was never reliably seen again. But there is one more piece of evidence, found not in the town itself, not in any archive, but in the collection of a private individual in Springfield, Massachusetts, a descendant of the Thomas Hennessy, who had recorded Silas Ward's letter in his diary. Among the effects passed down through that family was a small object, a child's wooden button painted red, and on the back of it, scratched in a hand too small and too careful to have been made in haste, were 4 words: "We went somewhere warm." The investigation. Edmund Gale did not know any of this when he uncovered that first cobblestone in 1999. He knew only that he had found something unexpected, and that the correct thing to do was to report it. He reported it to his employer, who reported it to the State Historic Preservation Office, who sent an inspector, who recommended a formal archaeological survey. The survey was approved. A team from the University of Connecticut began work in the spring of 2000. The team found the foundations of at least 40 structures. They found the well. They found personal objects, tools, clothing, ceramic fragments, all consistent with a late 19th century New England community. They found what appeared to be a complete town, frozen in a single moment. They found, in the tavern, a table set for supper. The plates were wooden and had decayed almost entirely, but the arrangement was unmistakable. 6 place settings, chairs pulled back slightly from the table, as if the people sitting in them had simply stood up and walked away mid-meal. They found in the schoolhouse a chalkboard. The wood had rotted and the chalk markings had long since faded, but a photographer on the team, using a specialized light technique, was able to recover a faint trace of what had been written on it. A lesson. An arithmetic problem, half completed, the answer never filled in. They found in the church a register of births and deaths, badly damaged by water and time but partially legible. The last entry was dated the 12th of October, 1899. A birth. A girl named Patience, born to a family named Aldrich, the Aldrich family. One of the first to go silent by Margaret Coyle's account. One of the first households to stop being seen. Their child had been born 3 days before the town disappeared. The lead archaeologist on the survey, Dr. Patricia Oduya, submitted her preliminary report to the state in the autumn of 2000. The report described the site as historically significant and recommended full excavation and preservation. 6 months later, the site was reclassified by the state as a protected natural area. Excavation was suspended. The permit for further archaeological work was denied on environmental grounds. Dr. Oduya appealed the decision. The appeal was rejected without explanation. She left the University of Connecticut in 2002. In a brief interview she gave to a regional newspaper before her departure, she said only this: "There are questions you are allowed to ask. There are questions that, when you ask them, a door closes. I made the mistake of not knowing which kind of question I was asking. The site at Ashwick Forest is now listed as a protected natural area, closed to the public, monitored by the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. The monitoring equipment installed at the site in 2003 includes, among standard environmental sensors, a set of instruments whose purpose is not disclosed in the public documentation. A researcher who obtained partial records through a Freedom of Information request in 2015 found references to seismic monitoring, thermal anomaly detection, and a category of measurement listed only as sequencing status. The most recent available record from 2012 shows the sequencing status as incomplete, not concluded, not resolved, not closed. The sequence in the well at Harrow's Crossing had not finished. It had been interrupted by the rubble fill, by the abandonment of the site, by the century of silence. The process that had been building for 8,000 years had been disrupted, left partway through its final stage. Whatever was below the well had not gotten what it came for, not all of it. The revelation, the truth of Harrow's Crossing, assembled from fragments, from the diary of a postal clerk and the journal of a school teacher and the records of a careful farmer and the unpublished papers of 2 researchers who were quietly removed from the subject, is this: the site in the Ashwick Valley was not chosen by accident. It was prepared. Not by the settlers who built their town there in the 1860s, not by any human hand within recorded history. What lay below that valley had selected it, had shaped the hydrology of the area over centuries to direct water through a specific channel, to build pressure along a specific axis, to create the precise conditions necessary for the sequence to advance. The well was not dug into the thing below. The thing below had, over generations, drawn the water table upward to a point where the settlers would inevitably dig exactly where they did. The well was where it needed to be because the valley had been slowly and invisibly shaped to make it so. The marks were not carved by any person from Harrow's Crossing. Dr. Marsh's analysis of the physical marks shows tool marks consistent with instruments that did not exist in the 19th century. The carving was made before the town was built, before the well was dug. The marks were already there, in the stone, waiting for the well to be built around them, and the families who drank from the well. The change was not immediate. It was gradual. Over weeks and months of contact with the water, something in them shifted. Margaret Coyle, who had switched to collected rainwater after the special meeting at the church, noticed it in the people around her, but did not experience it herself. She writes about it in oblique terms, the way you write about something you are observing but cannot fully name. She writes about a quality of stillness in the affected families, about the way they had stopped hurrying, about the way they sat in the evenings on their porches and looked at the hills without speaking, about the way children who had been loud and restless had become quiet and calm in a way that was not entirely natural. She writes, "They are not unhappy. That is the most difficult thing to say. They are not suffering. They are becoming something that does not suffer in the way we do. I do not know if that is a comfort or the most terrible thing I have ever written." On the night of the 14th of October, the final stage of the sequence completed. The water went down. The shaft opened, and the people of Harrow's Crossing, 300 souls who had been slowly and gently and irreversibly prepared over months, went down into the warmth below. Not killed, not destroyed, taken, incorporated into something vast and old and patient that had been building toward this moment for 8,000 years, that had arranged the geology of a valley and the flow of groundwater and the founding of a small town with the same casual long-term intelligence that a gardener brings to preparing soil, years in advance for a planting that has not yet happened. The man called Crail had seen it twice before. Vermont, 1861. Western Pennsylvania, 1878. 2 other towns, 2 other wells, 2 other sequences completed. 2 other populations that had simply ceased to exist. He came to Harrow's Crossing not to stop it, as he told Silas Ward, but to understand it, to document it, to answer the question that had no answer yet. What happens to the people? The wooden button with 4 words scratched on its back. We went somewhere warm, written by a child's hand, found in Springfield, Massachusetts, 40 miles from the valley. Who left it? How did it travel? Who carried it out of Harrow's Crossing and placed it among the possessions of a postal clerk's family in Springfield? The only candidate, the only person we know who left the valley after that night, is Crail. Which means Crail went down. Crail went down into the warmth below, and he came back up, and he carried one small object with him, and he traveled to Springfield, and he left the button where it would eventually be found, and then he was gone. Not never reliably seen again in the sense of absence. Gone in the same way the people of Harrow's Crossing were gone, incorporated, taken, but not before leaving the answer to the question. What happens to the people? They go somewhere warm. Aftermath. The Protected Natural Area designation for the Ashwick Forest site was renewed in 2010 and again in 2020. The site remains closed. The monitoring continues. The sequencing status, as of the last available record, is incomplete. This means one of 2 things. Either the interruption of the process in 1899 was permanent, and whatever lies below the well of Harrow's Crossing has been waiting for 1.25 centuries for a completion that will never come. Or the process is continuing, slowly, patiently, in the dark, below a forest floor where cobblestones lie under leaves and the air rising from a rubble-filled shaft is warm in a way that is geologically impossible, advancing toward the conditions it needs. The timber survey that sent Edmund Gale into the Ashwick Forest in 1999 was ultimately approved. Selective logging began in 2003 in sections of the forest away from the protected area. The operation employed a small crew of workers who lived in temporary housing about 2 miles from the site. In 2006, 2 workers from that crew were reported missing. Their disappearances were investigated by the state police. The investigation found no evidence of foul play. The water source for the temporary housing camp was a natural spring. The spring was tested for contaminants as part of the missing persons investigation. The standard battery of tests came back clean. But a chemist involved in the testing noted, in a comment appended to the official report, and then removed from the final version, a property of the water she could not account for. A particular quality of the dissolved mineral content, she wrote, that was unlike anything she had seen from a Connecticut groundwater source. That was, in her precise scientific phrasing, unlike anything she had seen from any groundwater source she was aware of. The comment was removed. The spring was not retested. The 2 missing workers were never found. The logging operation was completed, and the temporary camp was dismantled in 2009. The spring is still there. Closing. There is a particular silence in the Ashwick Forest on an October morning. The leaves are nearly gone by then. The canopy open to a gray sky, the light flat and even, and cold. You can hear the streams below, the gray run moving fast with autumn rain. If you knew where to walk, and you walked carefully, and you found the place where the cobblestones lie just below the surface, you would feel it before you saw it. A change in the ground, a faint warmth rising from somewhere below your feet. And if you stood very still in that silence, in that flat gray light, and if you listened past the sound of the water and the wind in the bare branches, you might hear something that the official record does not describe and that the monitoring instruments do not measure. Something that is not quite a sound. Something that is, perhaps, the echo of 300 people going somewhere they did not understand. towards something that had been patient for 8,000 years in the warmth below the world. They are not lost. That is the most difficult thing to say. They went somewhere. We just cannot follow. This is a work of fiction. All names, locations, events, and characters in this story are entirely invented for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.